Have you ever noticed how some people seem to live the same patterns over and over again, attracting the same toxic relationships, making the same self-destructive choices, facing the same failures, yet they call it bad luck? They don't question their role. They don't examine their patterns. They simply blame fate, the universe, other people. And they stay trapped in cycles they don't even realize they're creating. Now imagine if you understood that what you call fate is actually your unconscious mind directing your life from the shadows. That's where the real power lies. You have been taught to believe that life happens to you, that circumstances are beyond your control, that some people are just unlucky, cursed, destined for struggle. But here's a truth that perhaps no one has told you with this clarity. What you call fate is often just your unconscious mind running the show while your conscious mind sleeps. Carl Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Think about this profound statement. Your unconscious isn't some mystical force. It's the repository of everything you've repressed, denied, ignored about yourself. Every wound you haven't healed, every pattern you haven't recognized, every aspect of yourself you refuse to see. Do you know why you keep attracting the same type of partner who hurts you? It's not fate. It's your unconscious seeking familiar pain because that's what it knows as love. Do you know why you self-sabotage every time success comes near? It's not bad luck. It's your unconscious protecting you from the unfamiliar territory of achievement, because deep down, you don't believe you deserve it. Your unconscious mind is like a powerful director behind the scenes, orchestrating your choices, your reactions, your attractions, and your repulsions based on programming you received in childhood, traumas you never processed, beliefs you absorbed without question. And the cruel irony? The more you deny its influence, the more power you give it over your life. This is why some people seem destined for misery. Not because the universe conspires against them, but because their unconscious mind is running ancient software, outdated programming that once served to protect them but now only creates suffering. They react to their partners like they're their critical mother. They approach opportunities with the fear of their childhood failures. They defend themselves against threats that no longer exist. But here's what most people don't realize. The unconscious doesn't just influence your internal world. It shapes your external reality through what Jung called synchronicity, the meaningful coincidences that seem too perfect to be random. When your unconscious is wounded, chaotic, fragmented, it attracts chaos. When it's healed, integrated, conscious, it attracts harmony. This is not mysticism. This is psychology. Your unconscious mind influences your body language, your energy, the subtle signals you send out into the world. It determines who you notice, who you're drawn to, what opportunities you see or miss, what risks you take or avoid. And people respond to these unconscious signals more than they respond to your conscious intentions. So when you say, "This always happens to me," or "I have terrible luck with relationships," or "Money just slips through my fingers," you're not describing fate. You're describing the consistent output of an unconscious program that you haven't yet learned to see, let alone change. The question is, are you ready to stop being a victim of your own unconscious patterns? Are you prepared to look into the shadow of your psyche and see what you've been avoiding? Because that's where your real power lies. Not in changing your circumstances, but in making the unconscious conscious. Most people live their entire lives as strangers to themselves. They know their favorite foods, their political opinions, their career goals, but they have no idea what drives their deepest behaviors. They don't know why they're drawn to unavailable partners, why they sabotage their success, why they repeat their parents' mistakes despite swearing they never would. Jung understood that the human psyche is like an iceberg. The conscious mind, what you're aware of, is just the tip. The vast unconscious beneath the surface contains everything else: your shadow, your complexes, your repressed memories, your inherited patterns. And this underwater giant doesn't just float there passively, it actively steers your life. Your unconscious is formed through what Jung called complexes, emotionally charged clusters of ideas and images that operate autonomously. These complexes are like separate personalities within you, each with their own agenda, their own fears, their own desires. And when they're activated, they take control. Think about the last time you had an irrational reaction to something small. Your partner left dishes in the sink, and suddenly you were enraged out of proportion to the situation. That wasn't really about dishes. That was a complex, perhaps formed from childhood feelings of being unheard or unvalued, taking over your psyche and directing your response. But here's the deeper truth. These complexes don't just affect your reactions, they shape your entire life trajectory. If you have a complex around abandonment, you'll unconsciously choose partners who are emotionally unavailable, confirming your deepest fear. If you have a complex around unworthiness, you'll sabotage opportunities that could lead to success, proving to yourself that you don't deserve good things. This is what Jung meant when he said, "The unconscious directs your life and you call it fate." You're not consciously choosing these patterns, they're choosing you. You're being lived by forces you don't understand, driven by programs you never consciously installed. And the most insidious part? Your conscious mind will always find logical reasons for these unconscious choices. You'll say you left that relationship because of practical reasons, not because intimacy terrified you. You'll say you didn't take that risk because it wasn't the right time, not because success felt dangerous. Your rational mind becomes the unconscious mind's public relations department, spinning stories that hide the real motivations. Jung called this phenomenon projection. We don't see the world as it is. We see it through the lens of our unconscious complexes. What we hate in others is often what we can't accept in ourselves. What we fear in the world is often what we fear within our own psyche. What we call fate is often just our inner world reflected back to us through our external circumstances. But there's another layer to this. Your unconscious doesn't just contain your personal material. It also contains what Jung called the collective unconscious, inherited patterns, archetypes, and instincts shared by all humanity. Sometimes what you think is your personal fate is actually you being possessed by archetypal patterns. The eternal victim, the self-sabotaging hero, the person who always falls for the wrong type. These aren't just personal neuroses. They're archetypal patterns that can take over your psyche if you're not conscious of them. You become a character in an ancient story, playing out roles that have been repeated for thousands of years, thinking you're living your unique life when you're actually being lived by timeless patterns. This is why insight alone isn't enough. You can understand intellectually that you have abandonment issues or self-worth problems, but if these patterns are archetypal, if they're rooted in the collective unconscious, they require more than just personal therapy. They require what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming conscious of these deeper patterns and learning to relate to them differently. The tragic irony is that most people spend their lives trying to change their circumstances while leaving their unconscious completely unexamined. They change jobs, move cities, end relationships, start new ones, always expecting different results from the same unconscious programming. And when the patterns repeat, they blame external forces, bad luck, difficult people, an unfair world. But here's what they don't understand. Until you make the unconscious conscious, you will continue to attract, create, and perpetuate the very circumstances you consciously say you want to avoid. Your unconscious mind is far more powerful than your conscious will, and it will always win. So the question becomes, how long will you continue to be directed by forces you don't understand? How long will you call unconscious patterns fate? How long will you remain a stranger to the most powerful part of yourself? Because the moment you begin to make the unconscious conscious, everything changes. Not just your internal experience, but your external reality. When you heal the patterns within, you stop attracting them without. When you become conscious of your complexes, they lose their power to possess you. When you integrate your shadow, you stop projecting it onto the world. This is not positive thinking or wishful manifestation. This is depth psychology. This is the real work of transformation. And it begins with the courage to look into the parts of yourself you've spent a lifetime avoiding. The journey from unconscious living to conscious choice is not comfortable. It requires you to question everything you thought you knew about yourself. It demands that you take responsibility not just for your actions, but for the unconscious patterns that drive those actions. And most people are not prepared for this level of self-honesty. But if you're ready, if you're tired of being lived by forces beyond your awareness, then the path Jung outlined through individuation becomes your roadmap to freedom. The first step is what Jung called shadow work. Your shadow contains everything about yourself that you've deemed unacceptable, everything you've pushed into the unconscious because it didn't fit your self-image. Your anger, your selfishness, your capacity for cruelty, your neediness, your fears, all of it lives in the shadow. And from there, it runs your life. You cannot integrate what you will not acknowledge. So shadow work begins with brutal honesty about your patterns. When you find yourself in the same toxic dynamic again, instead of blaming the other person, ask, what in me attracted this? What in me participates in this? What am I refusing to see about myself in this situation? This is uncomfortable work because it means giving up the victim narrative. It means admitting that you're not just unlucky in love, you're unconsciously drawn to partners who trigger your deepest wounds because those wounds want to be healed. You're not just cursed with bad breaks. You're unconsciously sabotaging opportunities because success feels more dangerous than failure. But here's the paradox. The moment you stop running from these patterns, they begin to lose their power over you. When you can say, I have a pattern of choosing unavailable partners because intimacy terrifies me, you've already begun to break free from the pattern. Consciousness is the antidote to unconscious possession. The second step is learning to dialogue with your unconscious through what Jung called active imagination. Your unconscious speaks in symbols, images, dreams, and fantasies. Most people ignore these communications or dismiss them as meaningless, but they're actually direct messages from the parts of yourself that your conscious mind has forgotten. Start paying attention to your dreams, not for prophetic meaning, but for psychological insight. What characters appear repeatedly? What scenarios play out? What emotions dominate? Your dreams are direct communications from your unconscious about the patterns that are running your life. Notice your fantasies and daydreams. What do you find yourself imagining? What scenarios do you return to repeatedly? These aren't just random thoughts. They're your psyche showing you unlived aspects of yourself, unfulfilled desires, unresolved conflicts. Pay attention to your projections. What qualities in others trigger the strongest reactions in you? What you despise in others often reflects what you've repressed in yourself. What you idealize in others often reflects your own undeveloped potential. Your projections are maps to your unconscious contents. The third step is integration. It's not enough to just see your patterns. You have to develop a new relationship with them. This doesn't mean acting out every shadow impulse or being driven by every unconscious desire. It means acknowledging these parts of yourself, understanding their origins, and finding conscious ways to honor their legitimate needs. If you have a shadow pattern of people-pleasing rooted in childhood fear of abandonment, integration doesn't mean becoming selfish. It means acknowledging your deep need for security and finding healthy ways to meet it. It means setting boundaries not from anger, but from self-respect. If you have a shadow pattern of sabotaging success rooted in family messages about unworthiness, integration doesn't mean becoming ruthlessly ambitious. It means acknowledging your fear of outshining others and finding ways to succeed that honor both your gifts and your relationships. But here's where most people get stuck. They want to integrate their shadow without facing the discomfort of change. They want to become conscious without disrupting their current life. They want to break free from unconscious patterns while maintaining all the relationships and situations those patterns created. This is impossible. Consciousness is disruptive. When you stop participating in unconscious dynamics, those dynamics must change or end. When you stop being available for manipulation, manipulative people must find new targets. When you stop sabotaging your success, you must learn to handle achievement. When you stop choosing familiar pain, you must learn to tolerate unfamiliar pleasure. The people in your life who benefited from your unconscious patterns will resist your transformation. They'll say you've changed, that you're not the same person, that you're being selfish or difficult. And they're right. You are changing. You're becoming conscious. You're choosing yourself over your programming. This is why Jung emphasized that individuation often requires periods of isolation. Not because you're rejecting the world, but because you need space to hear your own voice without the constant pressure to conform to others' unconscious expectations. During this process, you'll face what Jung called the dark night of the soul. Everything that once gave your life meaning, the relationships, the roles, the identities that were built on unconscious patterns, will feel empty or false. You'll feel lost, confused, like you don't know who you are anymore. This is actually a good sign. It means your old unconscious identity is dissolving, making space for a more authentic self to emerge. But you have to be willing to sit in the discomfort of not knowing, of being between identities, of letting the old die before the new is born. The final step is what Jung called transcendence. This isn't about becoming perfect or eliminating all unconscious patterns. It's about developing what he called the transcendent function, the ability to hold the tension between conscious and unconscious, between order and chaos, between who you've been and who you're becoming. When you develop this capacity, you stop being lived by your patterns and start living consciously. You can feel the pull of an old complex without being possessed by it. You can recognize when you're projecting without losing yourself in the projection. You can make choices from awareness rather than compulsion. This is when what you once called fate transforms into conscious participation in your own becoming. You're no longer the victim of unconscious forces, but the conscious author of your life story. But here's what happens that most people don't expect. The world starts responding differently to you. When you're no longer driven by unconscious patterns, you stop sending out the energetic signals that attracted those patterns. The needy, desperate energy that attracted unavailable partners disappears. The self-sabotaging energy that blocked opportunities dissolves. The victim energy that invited manipulation evaporates. People who knew you before this transformation will be disturbed because you're no longer playing the role their unconscious expected you to play. You're no longer the reliable people-pleaser, the predictable doormat, the consistent source of drama or validation. This disruption in their unconscious expectations will trigger their own shadow material, and they may lash out at you for changing the dynamic. But something remarkable happens in this process. You begin attracting entirely different experiences, not because you're using positive thinking or manifestation techniques, but because you're no longer unconsciously creating the old patterns. When your internal world shifts, your external world must shift to match it. This is not mysticism, this is psychology. Your unconscious energy field, your presence, your way of being in the world has fundamentally changed. You'll notice you're drawn to different types of people, different opportunities, different experiences, not because you've consciously decided to change your preferences, but because your unconscious is no longer seeking the familiar pain or dysfunction it once required for growth. You've done the work. The patterns have been integrated. The unconscious no longer needs to create chaos to get your attention. But be warned, this path is not for everyone. Most people would rather blame fate than face their unconscious. Most people would rather repeat familiar patterns than risk the unknown territory of consciousness. Most people would rather be victims of circumstance than take responsibility for their unconscious participation in those circumstances. The comfort of victimhood is seductive because it requires no work, no change, no uncomfortable self-examination. It's easier to say, "This always happens to me," than to ask, "What in me creates this experience?" It's simpler to blame external forces than to examine the internal forces that shape your reality. If you're one of the few ready for this deeper work, if you're tired of being lived by forces you don't understand, if you're ready to transform fate into conscious choice, then the journey begins now. But understand, this is not a weekend workshop or a quick fix. This is lifelong work that will fundamentally alter how you experience reality. Are you ready to meet the parts of yourself you've spent a lifetime avoiding? Are you prepared to take responsibility, not just for your conscious choices, but for the unconscious patterns that have been directing your life? Because once you step onto this path, there's no going back to unconscious living. And that's exactly the point. When you finally make the unconscious conscious, something profound happens. The life you thought was happening to you reveals itself as the life you've been creating all along. What felt like fate transforms into a story you can consciously rewrite. You begin to see the hidden threads connecting all your experiences. That toxic relationship wasn't bad luck. It was your unconscious seeking healing for childhood wounds. That missed opportunity wasn't unfair circumstances. It was self-sabotage protecting you from unfamiliar success. That recurring pattern wasn't destiny. It was an unlived part of yourself demanding integration. This recognition is initially disturbing because it means taking full responsibility for your life. No more blaming others, circumstances, or fate. But this disturbance gives way to something far more powerful, authentic personal agency. For the first time, you're truly free to choose, because you're no longer being chosen by unconscious forces. The people who knew the old you, the one driven by unconscious patterns, will be confused by this transformation. They may resist your newfound consciousness because it threatens the dynamics they depended on. Some relationships will end. Others will evolve to a deeper level of authenticity. You'll discover that what you thought was your personality was often just your programming. What you believed were your preferences were frequently your complexes. What you assumed were your values were sometimes inherited beliefs you never questioned. But in this dissolution of false identity, your authentic self emerges. Not the self you thought you should be, or the self others wanted you to be, but the self you actually are beneath all the conditioning. This is what Jung called the individuated person. Someone who has integrated their conscious and unconscious contents into a unified, authentic whole. Life becomes creative rather than repetitive. Instead of unconsciously attracting the same patterns, you consciously create new possibilities. Instead of reacting from old wounds, you respond from present awareness. Instead of being lived by archetypal patterns, you consciously participate in archetypal energies. The synchronicities change too. When your unconscious is healed and integrated, you begin attracting opportunities, relationships, and experiences that serve your authentic development rather than your unconscious wounds. What Jung called meaningful coincidences begin supporting your conscious evolution rather than maintaining your unconscious patterns. This is the true meaning of making the unconscious conscious. It's not just psychological insight, it's existential transformation. You stop being the victim of your own psyche and become its conscious collaborator. But remember, this is not a destination, but a lifelong process. You'll never make everything unconscious fully conscious. New layers will always emerge, deeper patterns will reveal themselves, and life will continue to challenge your consciousness. The difference is that now you know the game. You understand that what appears as external fate is often internal programming. You recognize when unconscious patterns are trying to take control. And most importantly, you have the tools to respond consciously rather than react unconsciously. So, I ask you now, are you ready to stop calling unconscious patterns fate? Are you prepared to take full responsibility for the life you've been unconsciously creating? Are you willing to face the parts of yourself you've spent years avoiding in order to become consciously whole? Write in the comments, I choose consciousness over fate. Let's see how many are ready to stop being lived by their unconscious and start living from awareness. The transformation begins with this choice.